The Australian military is evolving. Without much fanfare or drawing attention to itself, the country has modernised its military capabilities, upped its spending, and transformed its defence posture. As a result, in these times of turmoil and unpredictability, the land down under is quietly becoming a major military superpower. Here's a look at how, and more importantly why, this is happening. For years, decades even, Australian defence posture focused on collaboration and alliances. Australia worked alongside the likes of the United States and the United Kingdom, among other key allies for peacekeeping missions around the world, and relied on those same allies to support it should the need ever arise. In other words, the Australian Defence Force, ADF, couldn't exactly be called self-reliant. It lacked the strength and depth it needed to deter any would-be invaders or project power across the Indo-Pacific region, and so, despite being the sixth biggest nation in the world in terms of physical size, Australia's military wasn't even ranked in the top 20 up until 2019. In 2020, everything changed. As tensions began to build up and boil over, with China in particular becoming an even larger and more imposing presence than it had previously been, Australia decided it was time for a change. It unveiled the 2020 Defence Strategic Update, a document which outlined a complete shift in defence policy and laid down a 10-year funding model that would enable Australia to enhance its military like never before. The aims of the update were clear. Australia needed to shift its focus to denial and deterrence. It had to improve its military capacities enormously to prove to the world that it was capable of defending its interests, warding off invasions or aggression, and thereby discouraging any would-be enemies from taking action against it. To that end, the update outlined several clear steps Australia had to take, like building a more lethal and integrated military force, not just capable of supporting allies, but also operating independently. It also had to invest much more heavily than before in state-of-the-art equipment, explore emerging technologies that would allow it to compete in the increasingly important fields of cyber and drone warfare, and bolster its alliances. All that demands money, huge amounts of money. Thus, we've seen Australia spend record amounts on defence in recent years, with further plans to push its spending ever upwards in the years to come, with a goal of 100 billion Australian dollars by 2034, which would be around 2.3% of the country's expected GDP. Here's where all that money's going. First of all, every good army needs tanks, and Australia has brought up some of the best in the business, M1A2 Abrams main battle tanks produced by the US. In 2022, the Australian government placed a large order for 75 M1A2s to replace its slightly older set of M1A1s, which had been purchased in 2007 but were never actually used in combat. While expert opinions may vary here and there, the M1A2 is widely regarded as the greatest tank in the world right now. Whether you're looking at firepower, defensive capabilities, electronic systems, or mobility, it performs above and beyond expectations in every domain that matters. It's also been proven in countless real-world combat scenarios. Thanks to that, any army that can call on a tank like this immediately becomes a force to be taken seriously, and the M1A2s will, without doubt, help to deter any country that might consider any sort of aggressive maneuver towards Australia. The ADF has further strengthened its ground forces with its acquisition of more than 200 Rheinmetall Boxer armoured fighting vehicles. Designed by an international consortium, the Boxer is famed for its modular design, which allows it to fulfill numerous roles on the battlefield. Australia can use these vehicles for anything from surveillance and reconnaissance missions to command and control exercises, joint fires, and even battlefield repair and recovery. They're also highly mobile and rugged, ready to tackle the tricky and unpredictable terrain of the Australian landscape. A big aim of the 2020 Defence Strategic Update was for Australia to increase its long-range strike capabilities. Well, that target too has been met, as the country has put $1 billion into a procurement of M142 high-mobility artillery rocket system HIMARS units. Australia intends to operate more than 40 HIMARS launcher vehicles, and even wants to set its own domestic manufacturing facility so it can create more missiles on demand as and when it needs them. Speaking of missiles, Australia is also looking to broaden its options should it ever need to strike targets hundreds of miles away. Along with HIMARS, the ADF has also invested in more than 200 Tomahawk missiles, some of which are capable of travelling over 1,500 miles to strike their targets. It's actually just the third country in the world, after the US and UK, to acquire and fire these missiles, and they open up so many new opportunities in both offensive and defensive maneuvers. So too do the precision-guided smart weapons that Australia is also investing in and developing, like Razor. Given that the country is literally surrounded by ocean, with more miles of coastline than the US and one of the longest coasts in the entire world, it's vital for Australia to have the ability to reach out across water and strike targets that may be hundreds or even thousands of miles away. These missiles and precision-guided weapons, combined with Australia's other investments and upgrades to its navy and drone warfare capabilities, give the country that ability. They bring countless viable targets into view, and while Australia has no plans to start firing missiles at other nations, the very fact that it's able to do so is so important. It's all part of that deterrence and denial strategy discussed earlier on. It's a projection of power deep into the Indo-Pacific. And if all of that somehow isn't enough to impress or intimidate the likes of China and North Korea, Australia has also brought its aerial forces well and truly into the modern era, investing in state-of-the-art F-35A Lightning II 5th-generation stealth jets. F-35s are pretty much the M1A2 Abrams of the fighter jet world. They typically top the rankings when it comes to power, stealth, and suitability for almost any kind of combat scenario. Capable of reaching speeds of Mach 1.6 or over 1,200 miles per hour, evade enemy detection systems with ease, and carry an array of internal and external weaponry, no mission is too big for a jet like this. With F-35s in the skies and M1A2s on the ground, the ADF has at long last become a force to be reckoned with. And if you were wondering how the country fares at sea, Australia is also hard at work on a significant evolution of its naval forces. The objective: expand the Royal Australian Navy to a size not seen since the end of the Second World War. Once complete, the fleet should include 8 nuclear-powered attack submarines, 6 Hunter-class anti-submarine frigates, 3 Hobart-class air warfare destroyers, 11 general-purpose frigates, 6 surface vessels with vertical launch systems, 6 offshore patrol vessels, and 8 patrol boats, with a deadline of the 2040s. And while Australia has bought large quantities of military equipment from other nations around the world, including the US, it's also actively improving its domestic defense production capabilities too. Because to be truly self-reliant in military terms, a country has to be able to make at least some of its own hardware. Can't rely on allies that may or may not want to sell vehicles and other equipment, with prices and circumstances changing by the day, especially in times of conflict. That's why we've also seen local Aussie companies like BAE Systems Australia and Electro-Optic Systems working on creating the likes of domestic drones, sophisticated optics technologies, and even futuristic smart munitions, some of which are already being looked at and bought up by other nations. This too represents a real shift in Australia's global military spending. It's long been regarded as a big importer of defense equipment and supplies, but is slowly but surely becoming more of a serious exporter too. Of course, hardware is just one piece of the puzzle. Every military also needs people. Troops are the lifeblood of the army, men and women willing to lay down their lives in defense of their country. This is an area in which Australia has historically struggled. It's a huge nation in terms of its physical size, but it hasn't got the biggest population to match. In fact, as far as population density goes, Australia ranks as one of the smallest countries in the world. Despite being close to the same size as the continental US, its population is lower than the state of Texas, with approximately 27 million people in total. Because of that, the ADF has never had massive troop numbers. It has tens of thousands of active duty members and reservists, not hundreds of thousands, though it has taken steps to address that issue by changing the law to allow foreign nationals of countries like the US, UK, and New Zealand living in Australia to join the ADF and bolster its ranks. But as history has shown us time and again, quantity is far from the only factor that matters when evaluating the overall strength of an army. It's also a question of quality. A relatively small force of well-trained, well-equipped troops can prove itself more than a match for a larger force without the same levels of expertise and commitment to the cause. That's something that Australia understands, and is part of the reason why the country is also committing to more intensive training exercises to prepare its troops for the prospect of war. We can see this in the way Australia has strengthened cooperation agreements with Indo-Pacific nations like the Philippines, establishing a joint military program that will see both Aussie and Filipino personnel conduct multiple exercises, exchanges, and training activities each year. This should both boost the spirit of collaboration between the two nations while also improving the specific military skill sets of their respective forces. Australia has also expanded the scope and effectiveness of its famous Talisman Sabre military exercise, which takes place every 2 years and is joint-led by Australia and the US. Talisman Sabre has been running since 2005, building up gradually over the years, with more recent iterations featuring greater numbers of military personnel and more countries than ever before. Talisman Sabre 2025, for example, involved approximately 35,000 personnel from 19 countries, with 3 additional countries in observational roles, making it one of the biggest ever iterations of the exercise. The event involved troops taking part in a vast array of training exercises, live fire situations and equipment tests across thousands of miles of Australian land and sea. This too is another impressive form of deterrence. It shows the world, particularly countries that could threaten Australia in the future like China, that the ADF is ready for whatever might come its way. It's a clear demonstration of the country's commitment to build a truly modern fighting force both for now and for the future. But even with all of its improvements in training and procurement, Australia remains realistic about its prospects and position in the world when compared to large superpowers like the US and China. It knows it can't go it alone and has always understood the importance and value of having strong, stable alliances with other nations. That's why, in addition to improving its forces and becoming more independent in many ways, the ADF has also sought to strengthen and cement its bonds with key allies, most notably the US and the UK. In September 2021, it entered the AUKUS trilateral security partnership with those two nations. The partnership aims to deepen cooperative efforts in defense, security, and advanced technology between the three countries, with the ultimate objective of strengthening their standing and promoting peace and stability across the Indo-Pacific region. It's also seen as a direct response to China's growing influence and assertiveness within that region. There are two core pillars of the AUKUS alliance, and Australia is the biggest beneficiary of both. Pillar 1 focuses on sending nuclear-powered submarines to Australia. To this end, Australia is buying up to 5 Virginia-class subs from the US to be delivered in the 2030s, and all three nations are combining their efforts and intelligence to work on a brand new AUKUS-exclusive sub, codenamed SSN-AUKUS, with the first Aussie-made subs expected in the early 2040s. Once the project comes to fruition, those submarines will arguably be the biggest ever addition to Australia's military arsenal. Pillar 2, meanwhile, focuses on joint development and integration of new technologies and capabilities like artificial intelligence, quantum computing, hypersonic systems, electronic warfare, and cyber defenses. It's all about using new and emerging tech to innovate and uncover new applications, systems, and strategies that will help the US, UK, and Australia to not merely compete, but lead the way in the next era of war. One that is not merely dominated by who has the fanciest tanks or biggest bombs, but who can harness the ever-increasing powers and potential of modern technology to their advantage. Gone are the outdated pieces of military hardware and the somewhat sleepy defense posture that defined Australia in days gone by. In their place stands one of the world's most rapidly evolving militaries. Modern, tech-savvy, and forward-thinking, the ADF is now ready not just for joint operations with its allies around the world, but also for long-range power projection, cutting-edge cyber warfare, and active participation in any full-scale conflict that could emerge in the increasingly tumultuous Indo-Pacific region or beyond. Perhaps even more importantly, Australia's military modernization is also a strong deterrent, a clear and definitive message to China and any other nearby nation that might consider aggression or intimidation of the land down under. We are ready to defend ourselves. Here's why that's so important. It's no secret that Australia is a truly unique nation, not just for its distinctive culture, wildlife, and amazingly diverse landscapes, but also because of its size, natural resources, and geographic location. Let's focus on the last factor first. Australia effectively forms the southern anchor of the Indo-Pacific. It sits in a prime location from a military standpoint, just far enough from the likes of China and North Korea to be out of range of most ballistic missiles, but still close enough to project force and influence across the region, into Southeast Asia and beyond. Thanks to that, major military forces from around the world, including the US, see Australia as an ideal place to base themselves. The US often sends Marines to the coastal city of Darwin, in Australia's Northern Territory for instance, and various allied nations' naval forces regularly stop off at Aussie ports. It's like a safe house for allied nations, a launching point for any future maneuvers into the Indo-Pacific, and a great storage base for the likes of submarines, aircraft carriers, and other military hardware too. All of that makes it an invaluable location for its allies, but conversely can also paint it as a major target for its enemies. This might explain why Australia has been working with the US to expand bases and improve military infrastructure along the country's western and northern coast. The US has poured hundreds of millions of dollars into this project, focusing on several strategic bases in locations like Learmonth, Sherga, and Curtin. So, should any serious conflict ever emerge, the US and other allies too will be able to send a sizable force to help defend the nation or carry out offensive missions further north. That's so crucial because, as touched on earlier, Australia doesn't have the biggest population, but still has so much territory to defend. That in many ways is a clear weakness, but it's one the ADF has sought to address. Bolstering its forces and infrastructure, particularly along the northern coast, is an essential part of that process. But why would anyone want to attack Australia in the first place? That's where the country's natural resources come into play. Given its vast size, it should come as no surprise that Australia is home to an abundance of natural resources, especially iron. It's got one of the world's biggest iron ore reserves, with an estimated 51 billion metric tons in total, which is about 30% of the world's entire supply. Iron ore is used for making steel, and steel is the lifeblood of industry. Countless industries need it in huge quantities to power their economies, especially China, which uses iron ore and steel for everything from public infrastructure construction, like building roads and highways, to defense products. That's why Beijing imports around 60% of its iron ore from Australia and is hugely dependent on it. Without that steady supply of iron ore, China would have to basically either buy it from elsewhere at higher rates or develop its own domestic production. That would involve creating hundreds of new mines, which would be a significant investment, even for an economic powerhouse like China. But China isn't the only country that needs Australian resources. The US too often turns to the land down under when it's looking for rare earth elements it uses in high-tech weapons production. China has colossal amounts of those elements and has threatened to withhold them from the West, which could cripple the Western defense industry. Australia is the key to counteracting China's threats, since it has one of the world's largest rare earth reserves. Combined with a highly efficient mining industry, it could decide to side with the US and NATO nations, supplying the resources they need, but undoubtedly angering China in the process. Beijing could retaliate in all sorts of ways, from resuming its on and off trade war with Australia to blocking vital maritime trade routes or even launching military action. In short, Australia sits right in the center of the burgeoning new Cold War between the US and China. And tensions are undoubtedly rising. China is building one of the strongest militaries the world has ever seen, amassing the largest navy on the planet, plus the biggest army, with over 2 million active duty personnel. Like many other nations, it's spending record amounts on defense, investing heavily in everything from tanks to warships to emerging technologies. It's the biggest, most ambitious military build-up seen in this part of the world since the days of World War II. And with that, fears are inevitably rising that the world could be drawing closer to the brink of another full-scale global conflict that could kick off unexpectedly and sooner than many of us might imagine. Many countries simply aren't ready for that kind of conflict, but through smart investment, a proactive approach, and complete commitment to modernizing and enhancing its military in every major way, Australia is more than ready for whatever comes next. Learn more about how a possible global conflict involving China and the US could play out in our hour-by-hour breakdown, or check out our in-depth analysis of why such a war is almost inevitable. Make sure to subscribe to our trusted news channel too for more detailed military reports, analysis, and news from around the world. And thank you for watching.